I fully realized how important our work is, there are real biological differences between men's brains and women's brains that have nothing to do with intelligence. If you're having issues with depression or anxiety during pregnancy or postpartum, there's a chance you may experience depressive issues or anxiety also as you go through menopause. That every time your ovaries cycle, your brain microcycles. These hormones that are connecting the ovaries to the brain, we call them sex hormones. But in reality, sex hormones are also brain hormones.
Okay, Lisa, thanks a lot for taking some time to do the interview. I absolutely love your book and your work as a researcher. And the truth is that I've been wanting, I think I told you by email, I've been wanting to reach you for a while because I admire you not only as a scientist, but also as a scientific communicator. And yeah, no, I mean, it's true. And well, when Maria told me that she can send me the book and I can do this interview, I felt like a very lucky person to be able to do that. So thanks also to Maria. Okay, so I'm gonna start like with some general questions, and then I think I would like to focus more on the menopause topic, and then on some strategies to navigate this transition period. Okay. So, well, first, you told me you have a daughter too, or two?
No, I have one. I have
One
one.
daughter. I have a daughter too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's enough for me. She's 9, going on 10.
Oh, mine too. Yeah.
Yeah, she's the love of my life. I just feel so blessed. And I think I fully realized how important our work is once I had my daughter. Like I knew that before, but thinking about her and her future is when it really struck me that the work that you and I are doing is just so important for the generations to come and to raise young women who are knowledgeable, they're comfortable with themselves, their bodies, their brains, their minds, and are just empowered to make good choices for themselves, not just in childhood, but also as they get older, and for the entirety of their lives, really for life.
Yes, I have the same feeling. It became very obvious that we need to work on this direction.
Yes.
So I first wanted to ask you about, that last week was the International Day of Women and Girls in Science. So I would like to use this interview also to try to motivate or serve as an inspiration for other girls and to become scientists. So I would like to hear about your story, how you became interested in science and specifically in women's brain health.
Yes, and thank you for the question. I so agree with you that just making sure that young girls are aware that you can actually make a living by using your brain is really important, right? And that there's so much to discover in this world, and that being a scientist is very interesting. I'll tell you something really funny.
Tell me.
Last week, my daughter was going to school, and it was like they dressed like your hero day, something here in the States. And I thought, who's your hero? Who's your super? I was thinking superheroes or something. And she said, Mom, can I borrow your lab coat?
That's so cool.
Yeah, she was like, no, that's me. She was like, I want to go as Marie Curie.
Oh, so cool.
Yes, and I was like, oh yeah, that's amazing. But so I had to buy a white lab coat for her because she's 9. Mine is very long. And then it came with goggles and with her name tag, with the ID card and
Yes.
those bio. And my husband is like, oh, let me get you these tiny little things that light up. They make like a green light, and then they covered it with Play-Doh to make uranium. And then she shows up to school, and everybody's like, are you dressed like your mom? And she's like, no, what are you talking about?
Yeah, it's Marie Curie. Oh, that's so funny.
I was so impressed that she wanted to go as a scientist, that her role model right now is a woman in science, and she wants to study chemistry. So this is something that is very much on my mind. So the way
So,
I got into science and women's health is because of my family. So my parents are nuclear physicists, both of
mhm,
them. Half of my family has a PhD, or almost. The other half is in the army. So we're
mhm.
very disciplined scientists.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes. And my parents are very, very, they're real scientists. They're thinking all day long. They're some of the most intelligent people I've ever met. And they gave me love, they gave me confidence. And when I was 3 years old, they gave me a whiteboard. They took up the entire room, like the entire
Amazing.
wall in my
Yeah,
bedroom with a gigantic whiteboard so that we could kind of go through equations together and whatnot. And then
fantastic.
yeah, I was really, I was like 4 with differential equations and integrals and that kind of stuff. And then their students would come over. This is normal in Italy back then in the 80s
Mhm,
because nuclear physics is such a small discipline, a small community in Florence, where I'm from.
mhm,
But the students would come over on weekends to prepare for exams and ask more questions and try to work through issues they couldn't solve. And my parents would just work with them in the study room, whereas the other ones would babysit me. And so
mhm.
they would talk to me about proton decay or cyclotrons or this kind of stuff. So for me, that's second nature. And
Yeah.
those students, some of them would then transition to nuclear medicine, which is a branch of radiology. For those who don't know, it's a branch of radiology where we use radioactive isotopes to look at, like for me, brain function and biochemistry and pathology. And so that's what I always wanted to do. There was never a question for me. Women's health came later
Mhm,
when my grandmother, I just started my PhD. I had just started my PhD in neuroscience and nuclear medicine, molecular imaging, when my grandmother, who effectively she raised me. I'm Italian, so it's
yeah. My grandmother also raised me. Yeah.
yes, my grandparent was always also my parents, obviously, right? But they were working, and so my grandmother really stepped in, and I would spend a huge amount of time with her. And she was an exceptionally intelligent woman. She was one of the very first women to get a university degree in Italy. And when I was doing my PhD, and I was studying memory and cognition and whatnot, she started showing signs of cognitive decline, which later on led to a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And what was even more terrifying to us is that my grandmother was one of 4 siblings,
Mhm, mhm,
sisters, and one brother. And all
mhm,
3 sisters developed dementia and passed away from it, whereas the brother did not. So that
mhm.
for me was terrifying
Yeah.
for my mom, for us, our brains, we would do anything to protect our mental health and our brain health. And so that was scary. And I started asking to my mentors, is it just me, right? Is it just my family? Or is there a bigger lesson that we can learn about the role of sex in Alzheimer's? And they said to me, you know what? It's a very interesting question because in 1994, 1996, it became evident that being a woman is
Mhm,
the second strongest risk factor for Alzheimer's disease after aging itself. But
mhm.
back then, and sometimes, often actually still today,
Yeah.
people say, well, Alzheimer's is a disease of the old, and women live longer than men. So at the end of the day, more women than men end up with dementia, but that's about it, right? A
Mhm,
simple, easy explanation. And that never quite made sense to me because women don't live that much longer than men. And then there's a whole number of reasons that just directly challenge that notion. But fast forward to my PhD thesis, actually, that's when we and others started showing that we got it backwards, that Alzheimer's is not a disease of old age, it's a disease
mhm,
of midlife with symptoms that start in old age. It's a very slow, progressive disorder that starts with bad changes in your brains when you're in your 50s and 60s, sometimes even earlier. and then take time because the brain can compensate up to a certain point where it can no longer compensate. And then you start forgetting things and you start having issues with attention and with language. And then later on in the 70s, we're able to make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Usually the average age here is 72. But the pathology, the lesions started years, if not decades, prior to that point. So that led
Yes.
to really changes the questions entirely to, well, then what happens to women in midlife that doesn't happen to men that could explain the higher risk down the line. And now I'm going to stop because
No, I think I love to hear that. And I mean, actually, to be honest, I have heard many of your interviews, so I kind of am familiar with that. But I think
yeah,
it's wonderful that we can share that. You know, when you were telling me about your girl and that she was dressed like a scientist, like a few weeks ago, I did like kind of a test with my daughter, like ask her to draw a scientist. And I specifically asked that in English because you know that in Spanish, maybe in Italy as well, we have una científica o un científico. So I wanted to know if he was drawing a man or a female, and he wrote a man. So it's like not even having us here. So I think that there's so much that we can do, and then there's the society that at least here in Spain still permeates this idea of scientists as male, and I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I
yeah.
try to do my best, but
There's something to be said about the way that women in science have been marginalized for
yeah, that
many
was my
years.
next question because I love your metaphor of bikini medicine, and I would like to hear more about that. What do you this sex and gender bias in biomedicine, and how do you think it comes from historically, and where are we going? Are we going on the right direction, or were we going on the right direction until recently?
Recently. Yes. Well, that's an issue that's been very dear to my heart in two different ways. I was thinking, first of all, that female scientists, I prefer to say women in science, so that we just
Yeah.
stay away from gender, anything, right? But women in
Okay.
science have a harder job than men in science, right? We get paid less. We're less likely to be invited to give presentations. We're less likely to hold leadership positions unless you really work really, really hard to get there. So that's something that is changing, I think, and hopefully will continue to change. Leadership is very important. And I find that when women are in a leadership position in science, that's when we may have a greater chance to really start looking at issues that are important to women as well, right?
Mhm. Yes.
Maternity, motherhood, postpartum, puberty for women, PMS, menstrual cycles, menopause. These are things that don't come to mind necessarily unless you go through them, right?
Mhm.
And I think that the scientific field has a bit of a tortured history when it comes to women's health and women's brains, especially women's brain health, where at first, starting with Darwin, the goal was to show that women's brains were inferior to men's brains. So a lot of the research back then was really about showing that women's brains are smaller, which was taken to indicate some kind of inferiority rather than just difference in size or head size. So that's been debunked. But then all sorts of things have been shown just to make the case that women should not go to university, should not have access to higher education, should just stay home and cook.
Yeah.
And then something happened, which was a little bit like, well, no, let's look at actual meaningful differences between men's brains and women's brains, which were then, however, still interpreted in terms of gender stereotypes, right? If you found that very discussed study, I think it was in PNAS, that showed differences in cognitivities between men's brains
Mhm.
and women's brains, which then immediately led to say, oh, that's why women can't drive, right? Oh, that's why
Totally.
women can't cook or shouldn't do their laundry because their brains just don't allow.
Totally. Yeah.
And that was labeled as neurosexism, right? Where you do the research, but the research is being used effectively against genders to just propagate negative and harmful stereotypes. So I think at this point in time, we have done so much work to actually show that there are real biological differences between men's brains and women's brains that have nothing to do with intelligence, have nothing to do with behavior, have nothing to do with personal choices, right? This is biology, and biology matters because our brains don't work the same way as men's brains in some parts, right? The functionality is different, the biochemistry is different, the hormonal component is different, the way that our brains age is different. And I think we are now in a good place to look at these differences without judgment, right? But just how can we use this information to provide better care for women and for men, but you and I specialize in women. So how do we make sure that we are protecting women's brains throughout a lifetime of use?
Yes. Yes, it's true. And it makes me think about this question like I often receive, and I'm sure you do also, that it's like, is there a female brain? And what they want to hear is this typical and easy to understand, like women are from Mars, or no, women are from Venus, right? Where are we? Where are we from? Venus or Mars?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's important that we explain, like, at least with the hormonal levels, that we have receptors for certain hormones, that these hormones are able to bind to certain parts, certain neurons, and induce changes that are different in men and in women. Great. So my next question is about the 3Ps: puberty, pregnancy, and perimenopause. Yeah, what do they have in common? And I will also like to recover this hormonal sensitivity, how these women with hormonal sensitivity might influence the vulnerability of women's health in this period.
This is really where your research and mine intersect. I find this beautiful niche almost, right? It's a nice area where everything comes together. Because what happens, I think, in Western medicine is that we're so focused on specializing in one topic or another, right? That we lose sight of the continuity. But biology really operates on a continuum. And what's really important to understand is that women are born, and so are men, but let's talk about women. Women are born with a neuroendocrine system that connects the brain to the ovaries and to the rest of the reproductive system, effectively, right? The endocrine system. And that these two systems, if you will, the brain and the reproductive functionalities, are talking to each other, and they're developing together, they're aging together, and they're changing together. And this connection becomes really evident at specific times in a woman's life, which are what I call the 3Ps, but they could be the 10Ps, right? Because it's puberty, then pregnancy every time you get pregnant, and then perimenopause, which is the transition to menopause. And what happens is that the neuroendocrine system is present at birth, but is really activated in some ways during puberty when the body develops, but so does the brain. I think it's really interesting to see what happens in the brain during puberty, because it's a little preview of what can happen to the brain during pregnancy and then during menopause. And what I think a lot of women don't realize is that every time your ovaries cycle, your brain microcycles, right? These hormones that are connecting the ovaries to the brain, we call them sex hormones, like estrogen, progesterone. But that is a relic of the past, right? That's because scientists discovered these hormones in the 1930s because they were looking at fertility and reproductive function. And so they're like, oh, these are sex hormones. They're important for having children. But in reality, sex hormones are also brain hormones, right? And they really promote synaptic plasticity. They promote neuronal density. They promote connectivity and blood flow to the brain and functionality and immunity. They keep your brain healthy. They promote, at least estrogen is a fuel to your brain. It makes your neurons work faster and make more energy. So all these functionalities have ups and downs in a way. Like anyone going through a menstrual cycle can tell you that sometimes you don't feel that great. And it's not that women are slaves to their hormones, but there is an impact on mood, on cognition, on sleep, on attention, even on body temperature regulation. And so as we go through the 3Ps, we can see commonalities where, from the brain's perspective at least, menopause makes sense if you think that all these neurons that were so important to have a child, right? The brain is really involved in a pregnancy and in postpartum and everything that needs to happen afterwards. But those neurons are no longer necessary after menopause. So that's a great chance for your brain to kind of let go. And that's my own personal opinion, that there's pruning happening during menopause that leads to a reorganization of the brain. And we have a study coming out soon about connectivity and how connectivity differs according to menopause, before menopause and after menopause, that really shows how there can be a reorganization of some parts of the brain where some connections get stronger and some connections are weaker. And the same has been found during pregnancy, right? And especially postpartum. And Emily, we were talking about Dr. Emily Jacobs before, she's shown something similar as related to the menstrual cycle. So it's really, everything is connected. And menopause makes a lot more sense if you think about it as one more transition along the neuroendocrine aging process.
Yes, and I'm sure you hear about the matrescence. We need to find a word for menopause and these matrescence, like mix between motherhood and adolescence. This word, like,
I don't love it though.
I kind of like it now. The first time I heard that, I didn't like it, but now I have to admit that I like it. This, because I mean, I think it helps the people to understand this process as a neurodevelopmental one rather than a neurodegenerative one. Because the first time we found this gray matter volume reductions, everybody was like, "Oh, women's brain atrophy with pregnancy." So for us, it helped us to reposition this period. And so one of the things that I found very interesting is this hormonal sensitivity, like these women that are highly sensitive or are more vulnerable to have these ups and downs in mood and anxiety and depression symptoms during the menstrual cycle are also those that have a higher risk, right, for postpartum depression. Are those the same that have higher risk for menopause? Do we know something? Is there like more an hypothesis, or are there empirical data really demonstrating that?
Yeah, I would love more data. I think we have enough data to draw a parallel, at least. I would say it's what I was saying before, that what happens to you mentally during puberty is a preview of what can happen during pregnancy, which is a preview of what can happen with menopause, right? So if you're going through puberty, let's say through pregnancy, and you experience brain fog, right? If you have a hard time thinking straight, or you feel mental fatigue or cognitive fatigue, there's a chance that may happen again as you go through menopause. And that may be actually worse, because at that point you're older as well, and the hormones also change in a more permanent way. If you're having issues with depression or anxiety during pregnancy or postpartum, there's a chance you may experience depressive issues or anxiety also as you go through menopause, right? It's your brain, it's your same brain. These are the same networks that are sensitized. Like I said before, they're very responsive or very sensitive to changes in hormonal concentrations. So once the hormones change, that's your brain's wired reaction to that kind of change. It's compensating, but those are the symptoms you may have. And it's interesting. And again, I would love to see a lot more research on
Me
this.
too, yeah.
Yes. But it's also interesting to think about compensation, right? That eventually, for most women, the symptoms do go away, whereas for others do not. And I find that the ones who continue to experience brain fog and subjective memory complaints, those are the women who are arguably at the highest risk for Alzheimer's down the line. The same way that if depressive symptoms just don't go away, then you are at risk for more serious depression as you get older. And that's when we need to intervene, talk about management. I love the idea of prevention. I know we're not there, but we're moving in that direction. And I think it's also really important to realize that, yes, some women are more sensitive than others, and there's a range of response that is only starting to become formalized in medicine. We still do not have an entry for PMS.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
It's still not
Amazing, yeah.
accepted as a medical reality, even though many women can tell you that
They have
that's
it.
real. It's not a made-up situation of midlife or whatnot. So I think it's important to realize that there's a range of response. And a lot of people are not familiar with depressive changes postpartum, where some women don't have any issues with depression or anxiety, just a little. For some women have the baby blues. Some women have postpartum depression, and we now get screened even at the pediatrician, right? You take your baby for your checkup, and you, mom,
And you are not get checked at all. Yeah. It's like once you deliver the baby, you're like a secondary thing. Yeah.
and
I
then
know,
some
yeah.
women have postpartum psychosis or more severe mental health changes.
Mm.
And there's an understanding, and there's an awareness that that can happen, that you're not faking it. Something is actually happening to you, and that you need help. And I
Yeah,
really think the same is true for menopause. We just don't know yet how to categorize this range of
I
risk.
know.
We need
Yeah.
to get there and quick.
I
Right?
always think about that, like we're trying to start a house from the ceiling. I don't know if you had that expression in
Yeah.
English, because it's like we're trying to diagnose, but we don't have the neurotypical map yet. It's like we have been trying to diagnose postpartum depression. We have been trying to diagnose like, I don't know, depressive symptoms of perimenopause, but we still lack the neurotypical adaptation. And without that, it's very hard to identify deviations from this normality.
Yeah. But
And
that's
yeah.
why I think that's why we need a modernized approach to menopause.
Mhm.
One
Yeah.
where number one is not just the gynecologists that work on that,
Mhm.
right? I
Yeah.
think it's a multi-organ change, and other
Mhm.
specialists like us, the brain specialists, might be helpful for some women. I mean, come on, we are. We should we
Yeah.
should be involved for some women, not all women, obviously, but for women who do experience brain symptoms, you need to go to a person who works with brains, I would say,
Mhm.
right? And if you have
Yes.
heart issues, a preventative cardiology would be welcome. If you have metabolic changes, then you go to an endocrinologist. So it should be more flexible in terms of
Mhm.
support, right? Yes, the gynecologist, the menopause specialist is your primary, is your first line of defense, right? But
Mhm.
they should be empowered with the opportunity to reach out to other professionals who can help. Weill Cornell, where I work at Weill Cornell Medicine in New York City, and that's the first thing I did. I took over the Alzheimer's prevention clinic, and I went to
Mhm.
my chairman, who's a neurologist, Dr. Matt Fink. He specializes in stroke, right? And I said to him, "Hey, I'm doing this, but I need to work with the OB/GYN department." And he was like, "What?" I was like, "Yeah, we need a direct line to women's health." And he was like,
Yeah.
"Okay, do your thing." And now we're basically triaging with different departments, with cardiology, with
You also
endocrinology.
have cardiology. That's so cool. Yeah.
Yes, because you know we have so many patients who come to us for brain fog because they're scared that that may be early onset dementia. Because there are so
Mhm.
many people now who have a family history of Alzheimer's, or they have genetic risk for Alzheimer's, and they're scared. And many are women in midlife who are
Mhm.
experiencing brain fog, memory lapses, forgetfulness, and they're terrified And so they come to us for Alzheimer's prevention, but very often I'm like, hey, how's it going with your menstrual cycle? Shall we bring in our colleagues from the menopause clinic, because that can be very helpful to you. And sure enough, that's very helpful to a lot of people.
Yeah, I love this multidisciplinary approach. I think it's very necessary. Okay, so next question. I have like some of them like written down because I don't want to forget anything.
Yes.
I think it will be good to kind of explain, like very briefly, what is perimenopause and what is menopause. And I know that this definition is a little bit tricky, so I would like also that you give me your opinion about how can we improve this to make it more operationalized for research, like this
Yeah.
vague diagnose that you never know when actually starts. So.
Yeah. So there's a textbook definition of menopause, then there's a research definition of menopause, and then there's another definition that would be something we could contribute to. So the traditional definition is this: for as long as you have a regular menstrual cycle, for most women, you are in the premenopausal phase after age 35. Once your menstrual cycle becomes irregular, you start skipping more than 2 months, up to 6. That is perimenopause, is the transition to menopause. And once you no longer have a menstrual cycle for over than 12 months in a row, then you are effectively in the postmenopausal phase. So menopause is actually one date on the calendar.
Mhm.
As of today, I haven't had a menstrual cycle for a year. But the actual stages are premenopause, regular menstrual cycle, broadly, perimenopause, irregular menstrual cycle, and then postmenopause, the rest of your life with no menstrual cycles, which could be 30 to 40% of a woman's life. Then the research definition is more fine-tuned because we're able to distinguish between the early premenopausal phase, where your cycle is really like clockwork for most women, not all. Then the late premenopausal phase, where your cycle is starting to change. It's still quite regular, but it could be shorter, it could be longer, it could be lighter, it could be heavier. You do notice a little bit of a difference. And that's usually early 40s for most women. And then around age 47, on average in the United States, we start skipping a menstrual cycle, right? So you skip 1 month, perhaps 2 months, up to 3 months. That's the early perimenopausal stage. Once your cycles are irregular for more than 3 months at a time, and usually more than 6 months at a time, that's the late perimenopausal stage. Then there's menopause, right?
Mhm.
The early postmenopausal stage, which is up to 6 years after the final menstrual cycle.
Okay.
And then more than 6 years post, you're in the late postmenopausal stage, which is for the rest of your life.
And Lisa, all the hot flashes and all that, like brain fog, when do they actually start? Are they becoming like more severe the more we advance and then go back? Can you
Yeah,
tell?
so for most women, they start in the transition from the early to the late perimenopausal stage. So about 6 years prior to the final menstrual cycle. And they continue for another 4 to 6 years after the final menstrual cycle. For some
Like
women,
every time I hear that and we talk about years, it's like
I
that's
know
very
it's
important. It's
a decade.
years. It's not months. It's years, please.
It's years. It can be 12 years for some women, the whole
That's
thing
a lot.
to finish. More often than not, just 7 on average. So the symptoms that are quite disruptive tend to start 3-4 years before the final menstrual cycle. I'm thinking brain symptoms. I'm not talking
Mhm.
about other bodily symptoms. I'm thinking about the brain. And then they would last for another 2 to 4 years after the final menstrual cycle, but they can last longer than
Yeah,
that.
and actually you always said that like brain symptoms, the more severe symptoms are brain symptoms as well, like hot flashes, um,
The most
um,
disruptive, for sure.
yeah,
The
sleep
reason,
problems. Mhm.
yes, yes, it's not even, a lot of our patients would say to us, it's not really the hot flashes. Yes, they're very unpleasant. they're difficult to handle for sure. But what concerns most people the most, it's either the lack of sleep or the brain fog, which brain fog is almost 2/3. It's up to 62% of all perimenopausal and early postmenopausal women. So it's a huge amount of women who just feel like, the rug has been pulled out of them.
And is there a correlation between sleeping and brain fog?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, there is a correlation, but they also happen independently.
Okay.
We have a paper coming out in the journal Menopause, showing that brain fog is, at least in our hands, right, is associated with changes with differences in the brain. Like we find alterations in brain energy levels that really mirror what women are saying. Like, I have a hard time thinking. And actually, their brain energy level is altered relative to those who don't have the brain fog, independent of
sleeping.
flashes. That's what, yeah.
That's so interesting.
And others have found it too. That yes, they are certainly associated, but they're also independent of each other. They're worse. If you have more than one symptom, you feel worse, obviously, but they're also independent of each other for the most part.
Wow.
Yeah, it's no picnic. It's no picnic, and it takes a long time.
So on your book, you also talk about different types of menopause, and I would like you to sum up them very briefly and tell us which have higher risk of dementia later in life, and which might be the main reasons for that.
Yeah, so this, again, I would love to see more data on this, but there are subgroups of women who are arguably at higher risk for dementia. And primarily, and there is consensus on this, that women who go through menopause early, before age 45, those women are at higher risk of dementia as compared to women who go through menopause in their 50s. And there's a wonderful meta-analysis that just came out, looking at over 20 studies with more than 4 million, almost 5 million women overall. And they showed quite clearly that women who go through menopause before age 45, and even more so before age 40, they have up to 70% higher risk of dementia as compared to those who go through menopause spontaneously in their 50s. And who goes through menopause early in life? Those are women who primarily receive surgeries where the ovaries are removed with or without the uterus before the natural onset of menopause. These women undergo oophorectomies, which is the surgical removal of the ovaries, with or without a hysterectomy, the surgical removal of the uterus. And we know that when both ovaries are removed before menopause, especially before age 45, those women have the highest possible risk of developing dementia down the line. Whereas if you have one ovary removed, the risk is increased, but not that much. And if you only have the uterus removed without the ovaries, there's still a 10-15% increased risk, but that is significantly lower than a BSO, a bilateral salpingo oophorectomy procedure. Now, I don't want anyone to panic when they hear this. I think it's really important to understand that we are talking about relative risk, not absolute risk, right? So the risk is higher relative to a woman who does not have the surgery. So for a parallel, risk is higher if you're exposed to air pollution as an individual, right? Air pollution is a risk factor for Alzheimer's. It does not mean that if you individual are exposed to air pollution, you will develop dementia. We're talking about relative risk or a risk factor. So we are investigating menopause, especially surgical menopause or early menopause, is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, which means it is one of many factors that can potentially increase a person's risk of Alzheimer's. And that brings us then to the next piece of information, which is really important, is that professional societies recommend hormone therapy, estrogen-only therapy, or estrogen plus progesterone for women who are going through early menopause, either because of surgery or autoimmune disorders, genetics. It's very case by case, but hormone therapy is recommended to support cognitive function for those specific women, those who are eligible for hormone therapy. Now we're also investigating a whole range of other therapies that are non-hormonal for the
Yeah, I'm
women.
going to ask you about that later, about the hormonal therapy, because I think it's a hot topic. And Lisa, I'm curious, do you think that this information that you just gave me, it's something that, like in the United States, it's something that gynecologists often know and transmit to their patients? Because I think that here it's not the case yet.
It's not known. I think it's barely known in my field, in the field of Alzheimer. Not a lot of people talk about it. We're starting, but not quite there yet. I think that many surgeons are aware. I think what's missing is a strict guidelines for ovarian preservation. So that is also very tortured in terms of history, but up to 2015, the general recommendation for an OB/GYN surgeon was to remove the ovaries along with the uterus if a woman was done having children, right? So let's say you, patient, come to the office and you're having issues with your uterus, not necessarily the ovaries. Let's say the ovaries are healthy, but you have endometriosis, a fibroid, all the reasons that lead to surgery. The surgeon would then say, are you planning to have more children? And if you say, no, not really, then they would be, well, why don't we do a full hysterectomy? It's easier in many ways from a surgical perspective and also reduces the risk of ovarian cancer in the future. I mean, reduces it, it brings it down to zero. So it's quite protective. What was missing was the connection between early menopause, surgical menopause, and the range of other risks involving a higher risk of osteoporosis or a higher risk of cardiovascular disease or a higher risk of Parkinson's or dementia, which again are not absolute sentences. It's just something that may or may not happen to you depending on a variety of factors.
Yeah, but you might need to know, and then you decide what you want to do, right?
Right? Because
you deal with your risk.
They're healthy. I'm just saying, if you have a reason, medical reason to remove the ovaries, that's a different question. Like, I think it's important for women who undergo prophylactic oophorectomies for prevention. Like, if you have a very strong family history of breast cancer or ovarian cancer, if you have the BRCA1 or 2 genes, those surgeries are potentially lifesavers. But it's still important to know that your risk of other conditions may be increased by the surgery. And then the question is, okay, how do I protect you against those other risks while also considering your risk of cancer? And I think this conversation is now coming more to the forefront because we're starting to talk together. The surgeons are talking to the brain specialists, who are talking to the gynecologists, who are talking to the cardiologists. It takes a network of individuals who are sharing information and making sure that the impact of these decisions is clear and is also formalized. But as of today, at least here in the States, ovarian preservation, so if you go to the doctor to have your uterus removed, but your ovaries are healthy, a lot of surgeons will still recommend a oophorectomy as well. It just happened to 2 people I know. I was talking to a reporter about this just the other day, and she was like, I'm really upset because this just happened to me. This is a very highly educated, individual in her maybe late 40s, early 50s, but not in menopause. And she went to the doctor because she had an infection in her ovary. And the doctor said, surgery.
Check it out. Yeah. I know many cases like that. That's what I was asking you. Yeah.
A friend of mine, same story. She had really bad, heavy menstrual bleeding. She was very uncomfortable. And the doctor's like, look, let's just do a hysterectomy. We're going to take the uterus out. And they're like, you're done having kids. Shall we just remove the ovaries as well? And she had actually read my book. And she was like, I'm going to have to think about this. And then she thought about it. She did her research. She thought about, her family history and whatnot. And she went back. She's like, I'm keeping my ovaries. And now they're very happy about that. You need to be able to make an informed decision. There are plenty of cases where removing the ovaries is the best choice, is the wisest choice, right? But many doctors are not
But
necessarily.
not by default, right? Like
Not by default. And there has to be counseling and there has to be communication, not just about your ovaries, but the impact that removing the ovaries can have for other organ systems. And then I would say I'm particularly invested in breast cancer and breast cancer survivors, women who do endocrine therapy for breast cancer are put on estrogen blockers or aromatase inhibitors, which block either estrogen synthesis or production or action throughout the entire body and brain. And they do often develop, when they do chemotherapy, they also get chemo brain, but also with endocrine therapy, there can be brain fog, hot flashes. They go through menopause, medically induced menopause, if they're not menopausal yet. And that's another group of women who really, I believe, need support because there's so little support in place. There's so little that we're able to offer them to protect their brains. It's like we're almost asking women to choose between their breasts or their ovaries and their brains. And that really should not be the case.
Yes, like you're just alive, so it doesn't matter the quality you might have, right? So that's not the case.
Those women are not considered in medical studies. They're usually excluded, right? Unless we're specifically looking at breast cancer or oophorectomies, they're usually, so we have even less information. And what I'm doing now, I'll tell you because I think it's good news, especially, this day and age. I started working at Wellcome Leap, which is a division of.
Yeah. I was gonna ask you like first because I read that and I think it's so cool, Lisa. I want to know more. I don't know if in this interview, but yeah,
Yes,
tell
I'm very
me.
happy to share. So the announcement came out, so it's no longer top secret. I could not talk about it for like half a year. This is so painful. But I'm so happy to announce that Wellcome Leap is sponsoring a $50 million US dollar program of research specifically about menopause and Alzheimer's risk, which I designed. I am the program that I run the program. And we are very specifically invested in women. It's for women who go through menopause for natural causes, women who go through menopause for surgeries, for treatments like endocrine therapy for breast cancer, treatments for endometriosis. We want to focus on women's health and the connection with brain health. And the ultimate goal is not only to really, really clarify this connection, but also all the strategies that we can use to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's for women who are at risk because of neuroendocrine changes or modifications. And so the ultimate goal it's called CARE, which I love, CARE, Cutting Alzheimer's Risk with Endocrinology. Yeah, I came up with it. I loved it. And I work with Dr. Regina Dugan, who runs the entire operation at Wellcome Leap, and she's the former director of DARPA, and she is such a rock star. And she was like, do it. This has to be done. We're doing it. And so CARE aims to cut the lifetime risk of Alzheimer's for women from 1 in 5 to 1 in 10. Right now, women starting at age 45, we have a 20% chance of developing Alzheimer's. Whereas men, like a man of the same age, has a 10% chance, right? And so we're aiming to cut the risk for women from 20 to 10%, which would be huge. And by doing so, we could realistically reduce the risk of Alzheimer's for an estimated 330 million women by 2050. And given current conversion rates to Alzheimer's, potentially prevent 55 million future Alzheimer's patients among women. So I'm really excited about doing that. We're starting.
Yeah, I understand. It's a very exciting project. Yeah, I want to hear more. Okay, next question that I think is also super controversial is hormonal replacement therapy.
Yes.
I know like some studies said it increases the risk of breast cancer, or others say the opposite. I cannot have been following the whole story, but I want to hear your thoughts on that, and how do you think this is going for?
Hormone therapy and breast cancer specific.
No,
So
I mean in general, like people have like this hormonal replacement therapy. Should I take it? Is it gonna be bad for my risk for cancer or Alzheimer, or is it gonna be protective? I know that there's all
yeah,
this debate.
I mean, we can talk about
Very briefly, because
we can talk about this for months. Um,
yeah,
I'll give you the shorter version,
mhm, yeah,
which is that a lot of these doubts that people have come from a study that ended 20 years ago, right? Actually,
mhm,
23 years ago at this point, the Women's Health Initiative, where women who were in their 70s and 80s, well, let's say over 65, started taking hormone therapy, very specific types of hormone therapy. It was oral, conjugated equine estrogens, CEEs, with an oral progestin called MPA. Okay, high doses, higher doses than we use today, different hormones that we use today, different ages than we use today. All the women were postmenopausal by decades when they were put on hormones. And in those studies, the risk of dementia was in fact increased in the women who were taking both estrogen and progesterone. It was not significantly increased in the women who were taking estrogen only. These are women with the hysterectomies and oophorectomies for surgical menopause. Now, I think there is consensus that that data just don't apply to women who take hormones in midlife as they go through menopause, do not apply to women who take different types of hormones or different doses, like micronized estradiol, micronized progesterone, which is what is usually recommended right now. We tend to give the estrogens transdermally through the skin, like with a patch. It can also be oral. But there are so many different formulations that have never been linked with a higher risk of dementia. And people don't realize that, or breast cancer. And people don't realize that. And also the data from the Women's Health Initiative just don't apply to Alzheimer's disease, right? Because they couldn't get enough people to develop Alzheimer's, that they couldn't look at Alzheimer's as an outcome. So they looked at dementia. And dementia
mhm,
is this mixed bag where most women, I think, in the women, or at least half of the women in the Women's Health Initiative have vascular dementia, which is very different from Alzheimer's disease, which is what we are trying to prevent because it impacts women more. And there's a connection with estrogen and hormones, whereas for vascular dementia, it's 50-50 between men and women, and is not necessarily hormonally prompted. So it's a different situation. And what we know, so that's the only clinical trial, unfortunately, that ever looked at hormone therapy as a preventative against dementia. And it was done in women who were way older. They can't be, it's too late to start prevention in terms of
yeah,
menopause, right? Ideally, you want to look at women in midlife who are taking hormones for menopause and then see if the therapy is preventative against dementia. But there's no clinical trial that can last 20 years because menopause, like midlife, is in the 50s. Dementia, Alzheimer's onset clinically is in the 70s. So you can't do that. What we're trying to do now with CARE, and other people are looking into that as well, we want to look at hormones taken now, and then
mhm,
want to look at red flags for Alzheimer's. We want to look at biomarkers for Alzheimer's. Like I want to do a brain scan and see if there's amyloid in the brain. And if hormone therapy can stop it from getting worse,
mhm.
prevent it from accumulating altogether. So this is a modernized approach to this question that is, but it hasn't been done. There's one study, it's called the KEEPS, there was
Mhm.
done a few years ago as a clinical trial where they showed the transdermal estradiol, the patch, was associated with fewer Alzheimer's plaques in the brain as compared to placebo, and also as compared to the oral CEEs that were used in the Women's Health Initiative. So that's very important news, but we need more work for sure. In terms of breast cancer, in the Women's Health Initiative, there was a 28%, I think, increased risk of breast cancer in the women who were taking both oral conjugated equine estrogens and the MPA. There was a reduced risk of breast cancer in the cohort of women who were taking estrogen alone. Now, we're scientists, so I know we can talk about this. From a statistical perspective, reporting p-values on an incidental finding is incorrect, right? So, or over-interpreting an incidental finding is not right, because the clinical trial was not looking at hormone therapy as a predictor of breast cancer. There was a side effect. Yes, it's important to report it, 100%. Everybody needs to do it. But then report it or interpreting that as a result of the clinical trial is not correct, right? Now, it's unethical, obviously, to do a clinical trial where you give people hormones to develop breast cancer. You can't do that. All the data that we have from observational research plus that study shows that some forms of hormone therapy are associated with a very small risk increase in breast cancer, or small, let's just say small. Professional societies now say that this is like the best, right? The best way to understand. Professional societies were really, really careful and really strict. They say that for women younger than age 60, who are eligible for hormone therapy and do take hormone therapy, combined, opposed or unopposed, estrogen only, estrogen with a progestogen, the risk of breast cancer is considered, the occurrence of breast cancer is considered rare.
Yeah, that says a lot.
So
actually,
I would recommend everybody looks at the guidelines. They're available online. They're the North American Menopause Society guidelines on menopause hormone therapy usage of 2022. And that's one of the opening statements that, the risk is not zero, but is not nearly as dramatic as we were led to believe in the past. So once you know the actual numbers, then you make your own decision.
Totally agree, yeah.
And I want to add, I am not pro HRT. A lot of people think I'm like the poster girl for HRT. I am not. I'm not pro HRT.
You're a scientist. Yeah. It's like I give data and you decide.
You do your thing. I'm not pro HRT. I am anti-suffering. So many women don't use hormones because they're worried about breast cancer, which is something that needs to be reconsidered from a risk perspective, from a risk assessment perspective. You don't have to go on hormone therapy as far as I am concerned. If a non-hormonal therapy works best for you, great. If you can handle things with lifestyle adjustments, wonderful. I'm here to support you. And in the book, I have a whole
Actually, that was.
Then the whole section about lifestyle, because every woman is different. There are some women who can take hormones, some women who would like to take hormones, but they don't work well on hormones. And some women who just, every woman is different. There are women for whom HRT is a godsend, women who don't tolerate it well, women who don't want to take it. And you know what? It's your choice. The important thing is at your brain.
Actually, like you have like all these part, like also collecting information about not only hormonal replacement therapy, but also other methods such as Mediterranean diet, sports, meditation, cognitive therapy, and I love this part because you always provide the information, and it's like, let's try which better fits with you. So I think it's one of my favorite parts of the book. So if you have to rank them for you, at least for those that might work for you or you think will work for you, how would you rank them? Like exercise on the top, diet on the top, meditation? Yeah, like
for me,
I want to hear you. Yeah, I was thinking about what personally might work for me, but I want to hear your.
So I am not in menopause. I'm not even near?
I think I'm very, I think I might be, but I'm like on the first part, I think
Uh-huh.
I might be close. Yeah.
So my answer may change
Yeah.
if I get symptoms that are severe. For now, I'm already doing everything I can to really support my brain health, and I've been doing it for so long. I am so structured, I'm so disciplined that my husband thinks I'm nuts. But I have all my little potions. I do practice stress reduction because I do have a lot of stress in my
I
day-to-day life, a lot
understand
of
that
pressure
part.
more than stress. So that is helpful to me. Exercise is extremely helpful to me. And I started, well, I have a treadmill downstairs. I have an elliptical machine upstairs, especially aerobic, because I sit so much. I'm
Yeah.
always
So,
to the screen. So movement is very important to me. Sleep. I
so you,
prioritize my sleep that there's no tomorrow. And I'm Italian, but I switched to decaf.
I'm gonna try. So, it's like I told you that it might be perimenopause, but I don't know how much is stress. Like
Yeah.
I'm starting to having problems for sleeping, like this. I don't know if they're like hot flashes or just the fact that sometimes I get stressed and I
Yeah.
don't sleep well, and so it's hard to disentangle this
Yeah.
stress in this point of your life in which you're like at the top of your, or what people expect is the top of your career, and what are actual symptoms of perimenopause.
It is really hard. I will say that a lot of women report changes in sleep, mood, and cognition before hot flashes begin. Some women
Mm-hmm.
may have no hot flashes or very mild hot flashes, but
Mm-hmm.
sleep is an issue. And look, yes, midlife is tough. No
It's
argument. And
wonderful, but it's tough too. Yeah.
yeah, it's tough. I mean, there's no discounting the impact of aging or stressors of all sorts, but hormones are a very realistic stressor as well. So I think it's important to realize whatever symptom one has, are those hormonal or is there something else that can be addressed first?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just jumping on a prescription medication, let's take a good look at our lifestyle and make all the adjustments that we can first and see how we feel at that point. But you need to be disciplined. See, the thing with lifestyle, especially for the brain, is that quick fixes just won't work. So if you do something intensively for 3 weeks, great, but that does not protect you for the next 3 weeks. You have to keep
Mm-hmm.
doing it. And I think that's a big challenge for a lot of women is making time, finding
Mm-hmm.
time. Right.
Finding the time to take care of yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And give priority to yourself while you have child and everything. Sorry.
Yes. Once I'm not going to recommend anything online, but there is one thing that really helps me sleep. So I'm going to email it to you.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, great. Because you know what? I noticed that on the weekends I sleep pretty good. So then I thought,
Yes.
because at the first thing I was like,
Yes.
maybe I'm perimenopause. No, I'm stressed. It's like my level of cortisol while I work just makes
Yes.
me be super activated when I go to bed. But weekends, it's
We didn't
fantastic.
talk about it enough, but one thing that I think we should talk about more for menopause is HPA axis dysregulation. Nobody talks about it,
That's, yeah, the relation
right?
between those things. I love to study that. I think it's super interesting, and I
Yes.
think it might also hold the keys of some of the risk for
Yeah.
other pathologies.
Oh, for
I
sure.
think
And
it's
a lot of women don't realize that this neuroendocrine system that we're talking about,
Mhm.
there are many different connections between the parts of the brain that are connected to the ovaries and the same parts of the brain and other parts of the brain. There's something
Mhm.
called the HPA, hypothalamus pituitary axis. That's a network of brain regions that are very important for stress, for instance, and for mood. And
Mhm.
once those regions, the hypothalamus and pituitary, are disrupted in a way because the hormones start fluctuating or maybe don't activate them as regularly anymore, then the whole network becomes in a flux. And that can lead to a number of symptoms that are not directly hormonal, but they're mediated by, right? So there are so many different aspects to menopause and they are complex. And I think we
And
we
also the
centuries of
Yeah.
research, right?
Yeah, and I like if you have time, like to explain like these hormonal precursors that can either be converted to,
Yeah,
so that's also an important point here.
yes.
Yeah.
So many things that we could look at. Allopregnanolone, I think we're talking about,
Yes.
like, is the mother of all hormones, and it can be converted into other hormones. So it's interesting, for instance, that testosterone can be converted into estrogen, and there's all these different chemical reactions that we don't necessarily take into account once we start the therapy, but they need to be taken into account. And if I know we're out of time, but if you have a minute, I think it's ridiculous and offensive that we are not yet able to measure hormones directly in the brain. We measure hormones in blood, but there is no correlation. There's no one-to-one. There is a correlation, but there is no direct association between hormone levels in blood and hormone levels or activity in the brain. And in July of 2024, we published a study that was thankfully very well received, showing that there is a way to do that. And if you do measure hormones in the brain, and we can do more, it's always, that was just the first step. But at least there is a first step where
Yeah. At least we're starting to do something. Yes.
at least we're doing something. And we were able to show the opposite of what everybody thought we would find, which is that estrogen receptors in the brain are actually upregulated after menopause. They're not, we saw from studies in rats or rodents or other, also some clinical studies, that the brain would lose sensitivity to estrogen within a few years after the final menstrual cycle. Whereas we have shown, at least in one study, which needs replication, and hopefully we'll replicate it soon, we're working on it. But what we've shown is that there's actually more receptors in the brain after menopause up to age 65, which suggests that the brain is actively looking for estrogen. Brain is compensating, right? There's very little estrogen. Let me make more receptors so that I can capture all the estrogen that's still there. Perhaps that's a call for the brain that's like, hello, ovaries, give me some estrogen. And if that's the case, then hormone therapy may be a good idea. But that needs to be studied. But I will say it's 2024.
Yeah.
It's 2024. There's over 130 million women in the United States alone who are on some kind of hormone therapy, starting with birth control. And we have never been able to see what those hormones do in the brain. It's incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. Yeah. I'm totally with you. I'm gonna have the last question because I think we're a little bit out of time. So I've heard you talk about your PhD mentor many times, and you always say like wonderful things about her. And I want to know a little bit more about her and why she was such a good mentor that you have like these nice words every time you talk about her.
Is it Robbie, Dr. Brinton? Okay,
That's yeah.
She's not my PhD mentor. So when I was doing my PhD, my mentor was fabulous, Dr. PV. And he is still very much part of my research, and I'm constantly texting him. I've been so fortunate with my colleagues in many ways, not all of them, but many. You're thinking about Dr. Brinton, who is my mentor.
Yeah.
I consider her a mentor now, and she's also a really good friend of mine. Her name is Dr. Roberta Diaz Brinton. She works at the University of Arizona. She has been studying estrogen and menopause and Alzheimer's forever, must be 40 years, I'm going to say. And I adore her. She's wonderful. And we've been working together since 2013, I'm going to say. I've learned so much from her, and we use this translational approach. She's a basic scientist. So they do a lot of work like bench work, in vitro, ex vivo, mouse models, rats, animals. And we do the clinical part. And then it's really helpful to us to them as well. Like it's a two-way street at this point. We started by saying, can I see in women what you see in your mechanistic analysis, so that there is
It's
a strong, even
amazing.
though we're doing observational research, it's translational in nature, it's anchored in biology, not just looking for whatever happens, which unfortunately happens a lot
A
in
lot,
my
yeah.
field with hormone therapy and whatnot. And now we're also going the other way around because we can do all these different types of brain scans, biomarkers, and then we're like, look, we're seeing this, and that. Can you check if you see the same in rats? And this just happened with the estrogen imaging study, where we were finding this increase in estrogen receptor density, and that was like, do it again. No,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
do it and do it, and because I was like, I don't. And then I emailed her, and I said, can you check if you see something like that in rats? And she's like, I think we did something like that in the 80s. Let me find out. And sure enough, she's like, yes, we find it in our female rats as well. There is an actual
That's
increase
amazing.
in estrogen receptor density, and I also had the mechanistic pathway at that point showing why that is the case. And I was like, okay, now I can breathe. I have anxiety about
Yeah,
finding anything like
yeah,
unexpected, or new or really the first time that somebody's done it. And so I was like, okay, if there's
it makes
evidence
sense. No? Yeah.
also mechanistically, then we're confident and we can move forward. And then there's also studies in mice in vivo with the same tracer, right?
Mhm.
So we have the whole thing mapped out and it makes sense. So now we can move forward and do more and bigger and better.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to see these results. Actually, I mean, it's impressive that we don't have these estrogen maps in the brain until very recently. We don't even know
Yeah.
where were they.
I need to show you. We have one of my students, Matilde Nerattini, who's fantastic from Florence. She made me a beautiful image. I'll send it to you if you want.
Yes, please. We can share like on Instagram if you
Yeah,
want to. Yeah.
yes, I have a lot. So it shows estrogen receptors in the rat brain, like it's a
Mhm.
three-dimensional map, and in women's brains.
I want to see that.
The similarities, but obviously our brains are so much more complex than the rat brain.
Mhm.
And the differences, how many more parts of women's brains exhibit estrogen receptors. They're everywhere. Low dose, low concentration, but
I
almost
want to
everywhere.
see that. Yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Let's do a post together or something like that. Lisa, I think we're a little bit out of time. Did I miss something? Asking you something that you want to explain or something? No,
I
right?
think it was good.